Welcome back to On Texas Football, the weekly edition of Texas versus the SEC. I'm CJ Vogel, joined by Gerry Hamilton here. Jerry, we're talking SEC football. Of course, the big point of emphasis this weekend, it's Texas OU weekend. However, the SEC conference does not slow down for this game, nor should it, because there's still a champion that needs to be crowned. And in weeks past, we've talked about, our top 5 quarterbacks. We've talked about which teams are looking like they might impress or disappoint coming into the season. But now, going into week 7, Jerry, there's certainly paths set up right now for teams to run the table and make a run to Atlanta for the SEC championship game. As we sit right now, 12 teams in the conference with either one loss or undefeated. 3 undefeated teams, Texas A&M obviously sitting at 3-0, Texas and LSU each at 1-0 in the conference. The rest all have a loss on their schedule right now, especially after last week. That picture to get to Atlanta is wide open after Alabama lost to Vanderbilt, Tennessee lost to Arkansas, and so on. Right now, big picture-wise, is this as messy a standings could look, 3 weeks into a conference slate that we could have imagined?
I think so. I mean, the Kentucky win at Ole Miss was a big one that kind of shook it up. Then Arkansas beating Tennessee at home. Those 2 games really shook this thing up. And obviously, Georgia's loss did as well, but to Alabama just because they were the favorite this year. So, and then Alabama losing at Vanderbilt. So, I guess what I'm saying is, yes, it's absolutely a mess. And after this weekend, we'll see where it goes, because there's a must-win game out there for a team that's already suffered 1 loss. But yeah, this is as wide open. I think this is the future of college football, by the way. Because the SEC is going to continue to expand. The Big Ten is going to continue to expand. Fans have to get used to this. It's going to be like the NCAA basketball tournament every week in the conference play, essentially. I mean, that's what it's going to feel like. It's going to feel like a seeding game every single weekend trying to make the NCAA tournament. So it is chaotic right now. And obviously the Vanderbilt win over Bama turned the conference on its heels.
Yeah, of course, before we dive into this week's games, as well as some of the paths that these teams have remaining to get to the SEC championship game, Jerry, going off of that point about each week being more of a gauntlet, how much more emphasis does that SEC championship win or appearance add to a coaching staff or a program when you consider, how rocky and tumultuous it is to get there?
If there wasn't the bye in the college football playoff right now, I'm not sure I'd even want to play in the SEC championship. I mean, I know that's kind of, hey, that's weak. That's kind of being a wuss or whatnot. But, man, I mean, like playing the extra game after going through a conference like this, and it does have meaning right now, but what happens when you get to 16 teams? I guess there's still seeding, but what I'm taking from this is you want to win championships. Yes, the SEC championship trophy hoisting, that's a big deal. But I'm here to tell you, like, based on what we're seeing right now, other than getting the bye, I'm not sure there's a lot of value long-term in playing in an SEC championship game. But that's not the way coaches think, and that's not the way the majority of players think and half the fan bases think. So it's going to be interesting to see kind of how this all evolves. But I can tell you this, the coolest thing for me, CJ, is how many fan bases think they have a chance right now.
Yeah. And that's even stretching beyond just the SEC championship, right? You look at the 12-team playoff, that was kind of, the idea when this, concept was birthed into college football is, hey, let's give more fan bases reason to think that there's a chance beyond just that first loss. But speaking about that first loss here, Jerry, 9 teams in the SEC sitting right now with a loss in conference, with most of those only having played 2 games. It's, again, pretty remarkable. And going down that list, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Oklahoma, some big names in there, Tennessee, that you would have expected to be in contention for the SEC championship game. Now that window tightens tremendously. As we go into this week's slate of games, I want one to kind of preface what we talk about here, and it's what the rest of the season is going to be in my eyes. The theme is going to be winner moves on, loser goes home. And I think that no game kind of encapsulates that more than LSU Ole Miss. That to me is it just screams do or die for the rest of the year for both teams.
Yeah, for Ole Miss especially, they already have the loss to Kentucky. So when they went in this season thinking we're a playoff team, we have a chance to be a playoff team. Well, I'm here to tell you with Ole Miss's schedule, the remaining schedule I'm looking at right now, if they lose to LSU this weekend, it's probably not happening. They still have Oklahoma. They're at Arkansas, who suddenly is a tougher place to play. You have Georgia. You're at Florida as well. And I know Florida's not great, but they can beat you in their house. And then they have Mississippi State. So Ole Miss can't afford another loss right now because then their margin for error to make the playoffs is down to 0.
Right.
If you lost to LSU this weekend, you literally have to win out to make the playoffs. And that's a tough schedule to just go win out. So that LSU can afford a loss and stay in the SEC talk. But the problem with that is, as we look at the schedule again, if you lose to Ole Miss this weekend at home, you turn around, you go to Arkansas and A&M the next 2 weeks, you're probably going to drop one of those games.
Right.
Then you have Alabama at home. Then you go to Florida, and you still have Vanderbilt, and you have Oklahoma. So, CJ, to your point, it's probably a must-win game for both of them to stay in contention.
I definitely agree, and especially with the way that each team is kind of unraveled so far this year. Is Ole Miss that physical? There's questions, right? They got kind of manhandled by Kentucky in a game that they were 18, 20-point favorites in. USC, LSU to begin the year, there were plenty of questions about what this outlook of the team will look like in Baton Rouge, especially defensively with some of those injuries that they've sustained since the season has progressed. Jerry, it's there's some big time questions and concerns with both teams, and when that comes down to it, will the strength of that schedule eat them alive? I'm starting to think so. But looking at the rest of the SEC, there's 4 games in conference aside from that one. Obviously, Texas and Oklahoma, we'll talk about them here in a bit. But, man, I would not want to be South Carolina, and I would not want to be Florida. South Carolina goes to Tuscaloosa after Alabama suffers the most embarrassing loss in program history, perhaps. I would say so. And, of course, Tennessee hosting Florida. 2 teams coming off of a loss, 2 teams now sitting with, a 1 in their L column in SEC play. I'm expecting big bounce back wins for both teams here this weekend to keep that dream alive of headed to Atlanta at the end of the year.
Yeah, I think so. And look, I mean, boy, if Alabama lost this weekend, Kalen DeBoer and the fan base would start having arguments. That's for sure. But I don't think South Carolina will be able to score enough points to beat Alabama, but I agree with you. It's bad spots for both road teams. South Carolina going to Bama after the maybe one of the bigger upsets, maybe the biggest upset in SEC history, and then you have Florida going to Tennessee for a little bit of a rivalry game, one of those underrated games. But that's just what the Tennessee doctor ordered for the Tennessee offense because they're going to be able to run the ball in Florida. Everybody has this season. So again, must-win games though for these 2 teams. I mean, beyond just the Alabama fan base losing their mind, if you lose that game, you're out with what's after that on the schedule. Same goes for Tennessee. I mean, Tennessee's schedule, look, I mean, they have Florida, they have Alabama, they have Kentucky, Mississippi State. They have 4 home games in a row. So they have a chance to go on a little run here before they go to Georgia and to Vandy. So Tennessee's still got a really good schedule because they have 4 games in a row at home.
Yeah.
But they got to go get them now. They're still a contender to me after that upset loss because the next 4 games are home. But that doesn't mean they're going to win them. That's
interesting because, again, not all schedules are created equally, as we've come to learn in the SEC. Texas, again, it sits very favorably for them this year. They're entering their toughest stretch, of the season so far. Oklahoma will be one of, if not the largest test that they will face, this entire year. Speaking about this game and speaking about the path Texas has to make not just the playoff, but the SEC championship game, let's play hypotheticals here. Should Texas lose, that Georgia game's a must win. Loser goes home then.
Yes.
Then you look all the way down the road. Texas should take care of Vanderbilt, Florida, Arkansas, Kentucky. Tough games in there. Texas on paper should win those games. And then it sets up what might be a winner moves on to the SEC championship game. And College Station against A&M, Jerry, it's a fun hypothetical, of course, maybe not in the sense that Texas loses this game, but the path certainly becomes very more difficult if that's the case.
Well, even if Texas loses one SEC game anywhere on the schedule before A&M, then this is the A&M dream scenario for them. As long as they win, but their schedule is the best left of the contenders. At Mississippi State, off week this weekend, and at Mississippi State, LSU at home, at South Carolina, at Auburn, then Texas. Tough road games. Don't get me wrong. Auburn's going to beat somebody this year.
They have
to. Is it going to be A&M? Is it going to be? They're going to win one of those games at home this year to close out the season, in my opinion. But look, even if A&M has a loss in there before Texas, both are one-loss teams in the SEC, and it would be the absolute dream scenario for A&M, because if they're sitting there with only 2 losses when Texas comes to town, then if they beat Texas, they're in the college football playoff. I mean, that is a dream scenario for A&M. Texas rolling in, let's just say at 10-1 and ranked top 5. And A&M is sitting there at 9-2, ranked 8 in the country. The winner of that game is assured to make the playoff.
Yeah, that's an interesting point there. Of course,
you would say Texas for sure gets in at 10-2 if they go 10-2 and lose to A&M. But you got to see how everything else shakes out. I would think, yes, you would say they get in, but what does that do for seeding in a playoff scenario? That's what we're talking about here, scenarios. But before the season, I kind of joked around about the A&M. What happens if this happens and that game has meaning? We're getting close to that game having a lot of meaning in your mind.
Yeah, 100%. And I think already you can pin it down as a game that will determine a playoff spot for A&M. I think that's just how favorably their schedule shakes up right now. And let's actually take a look at that. I'll spin back to the undefeateds here right after, but I want to take a look at the A&M schedule because they're off right now. They have 3 wins, the most wins in the conference so far through SEC play. But Jerry, they've got some tough road games ahead. You look at Auburn, you look at South Carolina. I believe they get to host LSU at least. You know, all their big games this year. Again, this has been a recurring theme when we talk about A&M. All their biggest games at home.
Yeah.
But those 2 games on the road against South Carolina and Auburn, 2 of the teams, 2 of the schools, 2 of the stadiums that you kind of think of and say, ooh, that's sneaky tough, regardless of how well they play on the field. If they get through both of those games, they're playing for a spot in the SEC championship, and I believe that they would be locked in for the playoff playing Texas final week of the season.
No doubt about it. And they're not going to lose to Mississippi State because the defensive front will handle Mississippi State. I really believe that. And LSU's interesting to me because Missouri, if you can handle the A&M defensive front, then Missouri had guys running wide open in that game. LSU's offensive line's really good. If they handle A&M's defensive front, even though it's a home game and A&M will be favored, that's a little different look than Missouri. But the problem for LSU is I'm not sure them and Missouri's defenses aren't about equal, which is not very good. Some of that due to injury for LSU, losing 2 of their top 3 or 4 players for the season already. So then you get to South Carolina. Can South Carolina score enough, even at home? Now, the home field advantage is greater, I think, than ever before because of parity. So the key there is how healthy are you at the end of the year? Because we're in the November football for A&M. How healthy are you? But if you win at South Carolina, if they get the next 3 at Mississippi State, LSU home, and at South Carolina, then even if you get knocked off against Auburn, it doesn't change your course. That's the whole thing. It doesn't change your course. And so that's the LSU one and the South Carolina are the key games for A&M because then you have a loss to play with and still have a chance to make the SEC championship because people are going to lose. I mean, there's no doubt teams are going to lose. I'd be surprised if we actually have an undefeated team at the end of the regular season.
I think that's a good point. Again, and that's kind of been the recurring thing that I've heard from you is that there's just too much ups and downs and teams that are competitive throughout this conference, especially since the addition of Texas and Oklahoma. We've already seen 2 teams go at it head-to-head that we expected to be in this conversation. That was Georgia and Alabama. Obviously, Alabama holds that tiebreaker now, but Alabama losing to Vanderbilt a week ago, that certainly throws a wrench in their plans. And looking ahead, that Texas-Georgia game, for Georgia, that's a loser leaves town game in 100%. Their eyes. And there's no more team, there's a team no more dangerous than a team that's playing for their playoff lives or playing for the hopes of what is the expectation at Georgia now, which is competing for national championships. That's a must-win game for Georgia. It certainly adds difficulty to Texas as well. But even beyond that, Jerry, the Georgia schedule, I mean, it's not a walk in the park. Should they even come away from Austin with a victory?
CJ, you hit the nail on the head. That's why it's a must-win game for them, because they still have at Ole Miss and then Tennessee at home. So after that Texas game, if they were to lose to Texas and they're sitting there with 2 SEC losses, go beyond that. That's not Georgia's expectation. Their expectation was to play for a national championship this year.
Right.
If they have 2 losses, they're down to 0 margin for error to make the playoffs. That means you can't lose to at Ole Miss, Tennessee, or even a rivalry game outside the SEC, Georgia Tech, which they shouldn't lose that game. But that means you have to beat Ole Miss and Tennessee back to back. I mean, they have zero margin for error. Like, if Texas beats Oklahoma and Georgia nips Texas, Texas still has a margin for error to still make the college football playoff. Georgia's done with their margin for error. That's why, to your point, Ole Miss has to win at LSU this weekend. Georgia has to beat Texas on the road and Ole Miss on the road. They have to win road games against quality teams the next 2 weeks. Speaking of Ole Miss at LSU this weekend, Georgia at Texas next weekend. Else, 0 margin for error to make a college football playoff. That's not where I'd want to be after 7 or 8 games.
I was going to say week 7 to be playing for my playoff life, not exactly the spot I'd like to be in either. Jerry, real quick, as we talk about it, there's 9 teams right now with 1 loss in the conference. Again, 12 kind of in that conversation that their hopes are alive. Going back to some of the teams that we haven't talked to, just stop me when you hear a team that has a chance to make the SEC playoff or conference championship game. Vanderbilt, probably not. Florida.
No.
I would think not, especially with that gauntlet of a schedule that's just now getting into its teeth. Oklahoma.
No.
Is that because of this game coming up, or is that just because, hey,
schedule? They don't have enough offense to navigate the schedule.
Missouri.
No. Not looking as bad as they did Saturday on both sides on both lines. Offensive and defensive line did not look like a contender.
Yep, they're missing Robinson, the first-round edge rusher off the edge. They're not really getting home. I did the numbers on the pressure, sacks, and missed tackles. Vanderbilt amongst the bottom of all 3. So not good for that Drinkwitz defense right there. And then I wanted to talk about Arkansas because they're starting to maybe make some noise right now in this SEC. They're 2-1 at the moment. And, of course, that Texas game looms very large, but they get to host Texas. And we just saw what happens when Arkansas hosted a top 5 team in Tennessee a week ago. That defense looks legit. And when they need a big play, it feels like Taylon Green, unless he's turning the ball over, is going to make the play. That team might be a sneaky dark horse. Could it be?
They're a sneaky dark horse with the win against Tennessee. The key is Taylon Green's health. Yes. Where is he at? Because they have an off week, so they don't have to release an injury report. And I don't know. I haven't been to Arkansas message boards to see what they're saying about Taylon Green. I'm on the road this week, but they have LSU at home, at Mississippi State, Ole Miss and Texas at home, and at Missouri, which doesn't look as formidable as it did before the season.
Good point.
Arkansas has got a really good schedule. They have to win 3 more home games against probably ranked opponents. Can you win 4 home games against ranked opponents this year? I don't know. Probably not. But
you got to extend Sam Pittman if that's the case.
Oh, yeah. I think Sam Pittman's probably already saved his job, honestly. I mean, they're going to win 6 or 7 games this year. That's what it looks to me, unless Taylon Green's got a season-ending injury or something, because then that changes it. But here's the key. If they get past the off week and they beat an LSU at home, who LSU's coming off a tough game against Ole Miss and Baton Rouge, and you got to turn around and go to Arkansas. This is all the SEC talk that I've been excited about talking about for a couple of years now. That is a really tough game for LSU to go to Arkansas, because Arkansas is a week off after beating Tennessee, and they play Ole Miss, and Ole Miss is fighting for their life in that game in Baton Rouge. Then you got to turn around and go to Arkansas, who knows Sam Pittman all week's going to be telling his team, man, hey, look, we beat LSU, guys. Where nobody thought we were going to be this year. And that's going to be the top of the upper echelon of the SEC. So there's going to be a lot riding on that game for Arkansas. because they see their schedule. They know, okay, Mississippi State, even though it's a road game, should be a win. Although will Mississippi State beat somebody? I'm not even sure they beat somebody this year. So Arkansas, sneaky. They got a shot.
No, I agree. They're certainly looking more difficult, as are the other road games for the Texas schedule right now, than what we thought coming into the year, which, again, I know Texas fans don't like to look ahead. They want to take it week by week by week, and right now that starts with Oklahoma. But, Jerry, before we get out of here, I got one final question for you. And after going through the schedules, after going through the paths, is it too early to predict a Texas A&M rematch 1 week later in Atlanta for the SEC championship game? Or is there too much to tell so far?
Too much to look. Texas' schedule to me has gotten more difficult. Everybody won last week that's on the schedule, if you consider Oklahoma won the bye. So everybody won last week. Kentucky gotten it together after a bad loss to South Carolina. I'd kind of written them off. I was like, Mark Stoops tried to leave. Now, and they're kind of bounced back before training him. The running back's even back. He's been out, so they're without their number one running back, and you would think he's coming back in the next couple of weeks. And they've been a banged up team. If they get healthier, playing with more confidence, they're a more dangerous team. At Arkansas, more difficult game. At Vanderbilt, you're gonna give it a little pause on the Texas side because you just played Oklahoma and Georgia, but Vanderbilt beating Alabama gets everybody's attention. So that's the change. That's the change there when you go play Vanderbilt. So it's too early for me because of the Texas schedule. I will say this: if Texas wins this weekend against Oklahoma, I could see an A&M and Texas game with one loss each in SEC play. And I think that's where you were headed with it. And if Texas handles their first rival this weekend, it's starting to align a little bit for that game having a lot of meaning potentially to play again. But that would mean if those teams played again, that would mean everybody that we've talked about is beating everybody, which is certainly possible.
Yeah, dog eat dog in the SEC, and there's a lot of dogs, as we just talked about.
By the way, CJ, that would actually make – if people think out in the SEC people hate Texas and the Texas and Texas A&M moving in the conference, while it's really good for the conference, it just means more in the SEC. If there was a scenario where A&M and Texas played in the SEC championship in year one, Texas is in it, that might change everybody really hate the state of Texas in the SEC.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm going to go out on a limb and say we're going to see a rematch right now. Of course, both teams got to do it. It's only week 7, but I like the way that everything lines up right now for Texas. And then, if Texas takes a stumble somewhere, then we'll talk about tiebreakers, but not for this week, not in week 7. But Jerry, thank you very much for the time. This has been Texas versus the SEC. The paths are set, and now it's about going and executing each week. Texas, and Oklahoma this weekend. That's step number 1 for Texas to make it to Atlanta. But thank you very much, and come find us at ontexasfootball.com.